Hello and welcome to our lecture recap of the first of our lectures on strategy formation. Don't forget that you can download all of these mind maps as a PDF from the website shown, or indeed buy the full course should you wish to do so. So the first thing we talked about was what exactly is strategy. Remember, strategy is the long-term direction and scope of the firm that achieves competitive advantage through the best use of resources. So what we need to do with our strategy is fulfill our stakeholder expectations. So we need to choose with our strategic direction where to compete, how to compete, and how we're going to achieve competitive advantage. So strategic decisions must meet these criteria, so they must be affected by the scope of what the organisation actually does. We need to match the activities that we undertake to the business environment that's in existence at this point in time. And we need to match our activities to the resources that we have available. The resources will be obtained, they'll also need to be allocated, and they'll need to be controlled within the organisation. The strategic decisions that we make will affect our operations, so they'll affect all areas of the business. And we need to manage our stakeholder expectations, something that we look at in detail later on in the course. Remember that strategic decisions affect the long-term direction of the organisation. So when it comes to planning our strategic decisions and our strategy, Johnson, Scholes and Whittington came up with a 3-step process. The first step was our strategic analysis. That was looking first of all at our external opportunities and threats, then at our internal strengths and weaknesses. That was a SWOT analysis, and we can use that to match up our strengths with our opportunities and threats with weaknesses to try to avoid them. We also need to do a stakeholder analysis at this stage and a gap analysis, which matches the performance between what we desire and what we expect and tries to close that gap. So that was the first step, the strategic analysis of where we are now. We then need to look at our strategic choice, how we're going to close that gap identified in the gap analysis. We also need to identify a competitive strategy, a direction for growth, and a type of growth that we're going to try to undertake. So the second step is our strategic choice. The third step is our strategic implementation. That's setting the plans and budgets, the key performance indicators, and the controls that need to be in place to try and implement the strategy that we've decided upon. So that's the 3-step process that we need to go through to try and implement a strategy. So the first model we looked at was the rational model. Remember, this is a model of strategic planning that is planned step by step. For example, following a certain framework like the Johnson, Scholes and Whittington framework. There are some problems with this, however, that we identified, like how to set the corporate strategy. Do we have accurate forecasting? Do we fall into short-termism or have too rigid a plan? Also, this might stifle initiative by having a step-by-step plan that must be followed. It's going to take time and cost money and may act as a security blanket, something you go back to when things are going wrong and think, well, it's okay, we're following the plan. That might not necessarily be the case. Also, we'll find that employees may be reluctant to change, distrust the techniques of those who are there to implement the plan, and there's no evidence to suggest that this rational model actually works in real life. So what about an emergent strategy then, where the strategy emerges, it's not planned, it responds to what's actually happening in the business environment? Well, this gives you the flexibility and isn't a step-by-step guide to what should happen. So that just emerges depending on what the business environment is. And sometimes that's seen as a better approach than the rational approach. There are various different ways to actually get the information for these approaches. First of all, we could undertake an accounting-led strategic direction. Say, for example, a 5% increase on budgets year on year. Or we could undertake a market-led strategic direction with looking at our competitors and our markets, undertaking benchmarking to see how those organisations are doing. Or we could have a resource-based strategy. Now that's focusing on the resources within the organisation and the core competencies that we have available to us, and that's something that we look at in detail later on. Remember that the strategic direction of the firm needs to be set at all levels. So we need to understand the difference between our corporate strategy, which is set right at the top of the organisation and decides which direction we're going to go into, which current areas of business should we maximise, and what new areas of business should we go into. As opposed to the business strategy, which thinks about the chosen markets that we've actually decided to go into and how we're going to get that success. The functional levels of the business then will be the operational levels, and the strategic direction that we choose will affect all of those areas such as marketing, human resources, information systems and IT. We also discussed during this lecture the governance of the organisation. Remember, that comes from the top of the organisation, the directors. The directors' duties are to act within the powers that are given to them within the organisation, to promote the success of the company, to use independent judgment, to take reasonable skill, care and diligence, to avoid conflicts of interest and to not benefit from third parties. Also, if there are any self-interests, to declare those self-interests to the organisation. The directors also need to take into account shareholder interests and stakeholder interests, both of which we'll look at in detail later on. We also need to think about the executive decisions that are made. So executive directors are those guys who actually make those decisions. For example, when it comes to executive directors, we need full disclosure of their pay, and we need to make sure that they don't decide their own pay, that they've got a remuneration committee to set those sorts of things. Non-executive directors sit on the board, and these provide an independent view. They should have expertise in the chosen area, so they should be able to bring something to the business. There should be transparent selection of your non-executive directors, and they should improve the credibility of the organisation by providing that independent view. When it comes to the board, well, the board should have regular meetings. There should be a separation of powers between the chief executive and the chairman, so that role shouldn't be held by one person. And there should be a split of executive and non-executive directors. So that should be 50-50 in a large organisation and at least 2 non-executive directors on the board of small organisations. When it comes to reporting by directors, it must be balanced. They must give full disclosure of all information, and they must publish the director's statement of responsibility each and every year. So the implications of these responsibilities, well, the governance bodies will be very powerful within an organisation now. For example, the audit committee in an organisation. They should have an awareness of shareholder and stakeholder interests. And that means there's a need for a tight strategy, i.e. a strategy that fits in with the requirements of all these different bodies and committees. However, we need to recognise that this can lead to short-termism, directors perhaps focusing on short-term objectives. And this may lead to lower risk strategies. Now, lower risk strategies are fine for the long-term direction of the firm, but you need to recognise that they will generally give you a lower return. Lower risk equals lower return. So we did a detailed example of all of this in illustration 1. That then was our recap of our lecture on strategy formation.